Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Pretty sure that covers everything. Anyway, welcome to the first episode of Insert Life Here, where I get to talk about astrobiology. So, what is astrobiology? Well, it's sort of in the name. It's biology, study of life, but in space. Now you may be wondering, well, we haven't found anything in space, and that's the interesting thing about astrobiology, is that it doesn't really know if it exists yet. It's a science, people can study it, but whether or not there is life outside of Earth is currently unknown. So the reason I'm interested in it, and the reason I'm talking about it, is because our best chances of finding life is in microbes, in microorganisms. And I find microorganisms really fascinating. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just how small they are and how somewhat complex they can be. But also, I really like space. And since astrobiology is biology in space, it's quite clear to see why I'm quite interested in it. So I thought today that it would be quite fun to talk about primarily how Earth has life. So one brilliant reason is that we have pretty much everything life needs. So we have oxygen, we have hydrogen, we have phosphorus, we have nitrogen, and we have carbon. And carbon, well, I'll get back into that in a bit. So Earth is covered in vast oceans, and oceans, that means water, and water means lots of oxygen and hydrogen. Now, water is really good for the diffusion of minerals in cell membranes, and that is vital for cells to exist. So our atmosphere is also quite good. It has 21% oxygen, 0.04% carbon dioxide, and around 70% nitrogen. And that is very, very, very good for life. But also, the greenhouse effect, which we all keep hearing about, is really useful for keeping our Earth warm. So the greenhouse effect is the absorption and re-radiation of radiation from the sun back into the surface of the Earth. So the sun shoots its radiation into the Earth bounces that back up, but the gases in the atmosphere reflect it back down, so that keeps us warm. So another point is our climate. Our climate is relatively stable, meaning it doesn't really fluctuate into temperatures unsuitable for life, which is obviously very useful because it's all good having good, habitable temperature for 100 years, but after that everything would probably die if it wasn't for a stable climate. Light from the sun is also very useful as it allows photosynthesis to occur, which would allow more complicated life to evolve, since chemosynthesis, which is using chemicals from the environment, usually only it can support very, very simple life. But since chemosynthesis does work in such a way to support large amounts of microorganisms, it suggests that life can form in areas without any light, and which has chemicals, which is usually CO2 being the main factor in chemosynthesis. The ozone layer in the Earth is also pretty darn useful, as it protects us from UV radiation, which is very, very dangerous in high concentrations. Now again, if our life was deep underground, this probably wouldn't matter to them, but for complicated life we know it is. So the Earth's magnetic field also helps protect the atmosphere. So Mars has a very thin atmosphere due to its weak magnetic field, as it lost its magnetosphere around 4 billion years ago. So, or perhaps if that never occurred, if it managed to keep its magnetosphere, perhaps life could have developed. But since its magnetosphere was lost, its atmosphere became very thin to the point where it wouldn't be able to support any life or keep it warm. So, all life on Earth, and potentially all life we know of, has been carbon-based. So since carbon is so useful to us, it is used in complicated compounds inside of us, like DNA, and many molecules we have are all use carbon as the base building blocks. It's reactive, but not too reactive. It has 4 delocalized electrons, meaning it can react with other things, and most importantly, can form chains of carbon. And as I said, this allows the creation of DNA. But also more basic substances like glucose, or any other energy stores using carbon bonds. So without these, complicated life cannot form. But that doesn't necessarily mean simple life can't. Well, I'm thinking silicon, you've probably all heard about it, but maybe not all, but silicon being just above carbon in the periodic table, many people have theorized or got used in sci-fi movies that life could be silicon based. Well, the only problem is that it's completely impossible on Earth. So silicon itself reacts quite violently with oxygen. So, if a microbe was to one day decide, yes, let's use silicon instead of carbon, well, it wouldn't last very long. However, it can form long chains like carbon can. So it can be, if oxygen is not present, it still can form long chains, which is again very useful. Though both carbon and silicon can form many different molecules, double bonded silicon bonds are transient, and this basically means that the bonds are too unstable that it eventually forces itself to revert back to a single bonded silicon atom. Carbon doesn't have this issue, as you could probably guess. It's not too frail to break apart, but not too rigid to prevent alteration. So this quality of carbon allows it to be manipulated and changed by enzymes, which are essential for chemical reactions. Furthermore, reactions with silicon aren't really that efficient, since, well, think about it. Silicon dioxide is sand, and sand is quite big, but carbon dioxide is quite happy being a gas. So it doesn't look like we're going to see any silicon-based life forms very soon, since they seem to be very demanding and not all that good at, well, being alive. However, this doesn't mean things don't use silicon. One such quote-unquote silicon user are diatoms. So these tiny algae are surprisingly common, generating by themselves about 20 to 50% of the oxygen produced on the planet each year. And the reason I said they use silicon is that they have a transparent silicate cell wall. So though they aren't necessarily silicon-based life, it does mean that silicon or silicate can be extensively used by life. Anyway, let's talk about these diatoms. So one very, very interesting thing about diatoms is how they reproduce. Firstly, the diatoms asexually reproduce through binary fission. This means that the parent cell grows larger to split into 2 daughter cells, 2 identical daughter cells. However, due to their silicate walls, almost imagine being like glass, they decrease in size every time this happens because they can't grow. This is where the sexual reproduction comes in. The male and female diatoms produce sperm cells and egg cells respectively, and these then fuse together. At this state, the embryo grows until it is the size of a full-sized diatom. So this means that the sexual reproduction causes diatoms to grow back to their original size, which is quite crazy. You can almost say if you plotted a graph of diatom size through time, it would kind of go up, then down, and up, then down as they start switching from asexual to sexual reproduction. So, to sum up, They initially follow the primary modes of reproduction, you see asexual reproduction, but when cell size in the population decreases considerably, they switch over to sexual reproduction. So, that's all I have time for today. Thank you for listening, learning about why silicon-based life is actually quite the terrible idea, and also learning something about diatoms, or even just learning about their existence. Anyway, this has been Insert Life Here, and hope to see you next time. Goodbye.